Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us here tonight. Welcome. This is one of our earlier events of Remembrance Week of 2016. This is the panel Doing Memory, Doing Justice. My name is Farrell Brenner, and I am a 2016-2017 Remembrance Scholar. I will be moderating tonight's panel.
Hi, my name is Ahmed Malik. I'm the Muslim chaplain at Hendricks Chapel at Syracuse University and also the advisor of the Muslim Student Association. I'll be also co-moderating this panel with her.
Before we begin, I'd like to thank a few people. Many folks came together tonight to make this event possible. First of all, the Remembrance Scholarship Advisors, Judy O'Rourke, Vanessa St. Oberman, Kelly Radowski, and Kate Hansen for their support and guidance. The panels, presentations, and performances committee who helped to organize the many moving parts of this evening. The Muslim Student Association who is co-sponsoring this event.
And the Interfaith Dialogue Dinner Series that's held at the Hendricks Chapel in collaboration with the Disability Cultural Center. And this time around, the Remembrance Week is co-sponsoring that event, which will happen this month on Wednesday, October 26th at 6:30 p.m. in the Noble Room in Hendricks Chapel. The dialogue will be focusing on Islamophobia on campus and how it relates to remembrance.
And we'd also like to thank the panelists who are going to introduce them a little bit for generously sharing their time and energy with us tonight. And I'd like to thank also Muslim Chaplain Ahmed Malik, who is co-moderating with me. Thank you very much for being here. And also Aurora of CNY for interpreting tonight's event. So, without further ado, we're going to get started. I'm going to give a bit of background first on why we do Remembrance and what it's all about before we get into our discussion. On December 21st, 1988, Pan Am Flight 103 was bombed over Lockerbie, Scotland. 35 Syracuse University abroad students died, along with 224 others on board and 11 residents of Lockerbie. After a 3-year joint investigation, the bombing was ultimately linked to 2 Libyan nationals, one of whom was convicted. Both civil and international investigations were characterized by widespread perjury and contradictory evidence by several witnesses. While various groups claimed responsibility for the bombing, in 2003, Libyan leader Colonel Muammar Gaddafi admitted Libya's culpability and paid compensation to the affected families. However, he maintained that he himself never gave an order to attack. For nearly 13 years, it was considered the deadliest terrorist attack against U.S. citizens and is still considered the deadliest terrorist attack against British citizens until September 11, 2001, when that became the deadliest terrorist attack against U.S. citizens. We memorialize the lives lost to date through Remembrance Week, the Remembrance Scholarship, and the Lockerbie Scholarship at Syracuse University, all of which have become an integral part of the campus community identity. This panel is a part of the 2016 Remembrance Week, and represents an opportunity for a critical discussion around the politics of memory. Tonight we will discuss how our memorialization of Pan Am Flight 103 is connected to narratives of terrorism. So first, I am going to introduce our first panelist. The right paper out. So sitting next to me is Dr. Charisse Laprie-Corsby-Messing. She is an assistant professor of communications at the S.I. Newhouse School of Public Communications at Syracuse University. Her research investigates the relationship between media and identity to understand how media affect the way we think about ourselves and others, and how we use media to construct and reaffirm positive identities. Her TEDx Syracuse talk, The Psychology of Selfies, considers how digital self-portraiture can be used as a self-esteem intervention and a way to engage with social issues. Her most recent book chapter explores how social scientists manipulate race and gender in experimentation and how that affects our understanding of these concepts. Please welcome Dr. Charisse Laprie-Corsby-Messing.
I'm going to set my timer for 10 minutes because I usually talk for 80. So I keep going. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for for inviting me to be a part of such a major event and piece of Syracuse identity. I'll be completely honest, I actually was speaking in Boston this weekend, and so when I got invited to this, I looked at my schedule, and I'm like, I don't know if this is a good idea. I'm spread way too thin. But knowing what really made the choice for me was knowing the importance of remembrance to the university as a whole, and just eager to be a part of that conversation and that annual event that makes a point to discuss, remember, to some degree relive the stories of those that were lost. And in the reliving and the retelling of those stories, that we hold them in our memory, and we continue to engage with, talk about, and be a part of large socio-cultural phenomena that are still very much affecting and plaguing us today. So that's why I couldn't say no. Having said that, then I had to think about what I was going to talk about. And of course, I want to talk about all the things, right? All the things, everything. I teach race and gender at Newhouse, specifically race and gender in media. So how do we talk about race? How do we talk about gender in media? How does that affect our self-concepts as related, gender, race, class, ableism, sexuality, like all the things. All the things. It's a pretty intense class, you should totally read. But how does the media presentation of these categories affect the way we think about ourselves and affect the way we engage with other people? That the narratives that are presented to us, especially for those who may have no interaction with other people, become the defining information that we know as to how to engage with these other people. And I'll just say, as I was saying earlier, fun fact, of course none of my facts are ever fun, they're usually pretty sad and depressing, but fun fact, 40% of white Americans have no non-white friends, and 25% of non-white Americans have no white friends, right? So this is just an example of how we are separated in these characteristics, categories, groups, and identities. So what I would like to take my time to talk with you about today is the difference between characteristic, category, group, and identity, and how media fits into each level of our understanding of ourselves and others. So a characteristic, by definition, is a piece of information. It may be a piece of information about you, it may be a piece of information about history, it can be a piece of information about anything. That you have a series of characteristics. The example I gave, it's pronounced Farrell, right? Okay. The example I gave Farrell earlier is that she is wearing a necklace and I am not wearing a necklace. That's a characteristic, that is a factual piece of information. It could be the color of your skin, it could be the quality of your hair, it could be what you choose to wear. At any given point, these are just pieces of information, characteristics. That characteristic becomes a category when we start to group people together, or things, when we start to construct groups around that characteristic. We very rarely see people separated based on whether or not they're wearing jewelry, but I think we can all think about situations where we have done so, right? If we think about red carpet, who's wearing a necklace, who's not wearing a necklace, who's carrying a bag, who's carrying a Gucci bag, whatever, right? That we begin to categorize people. And when we do that, a characteristic evolves into something more. It becomes a way to think about and understand different people. Then when we talk about racialized thinking, we are taking that characteristic and that category and putting other indications on it. So if you have this characteristic, then you must do all of these other things because that's what I know about this person, these people in this category. Right? So categorical thinking or categorizing makes it easier on the brain. It is a cognitive strategy, but it is one that if we don't pay attention to, we can allow this to drive our behaviors as opposed to seeing what our brain is setting us up to do. And more importantly, what it's setting us up to do is not think deeply about other people. So now we have a category. This category becomes a group when the individuals within this category have shared interests. Robbie and Horowitz, don't worry, you don't need to know the citation. Robbie and Horowitz nerd joke, sorry. Rabi and Horowitz argue that when a category becomes a locomoting entity, so an example is we are all affiliated with Syracuse. That characteristic becomes a category and a group on game day, where we all want to win. We all have a shared goal, and it is a locomoting entity, or we are moving towards the same thing. Having said that, that group, the importance of that group to you personally is your identity. So it's easy to say this person identifies as X, Y, or Z. That's usually a binary label, right? You either are A or B, X or Y. But the extent to which that group is important to you is your identity. It is a continuous variable. You may be high identified with something or low identified with something. And the reason I bring all of this up, the reason I bring all of this up is because at every stage of this cognitive process, media can have an impact. Media has an impact on our understanding of what characteristics are important, what we should be looking at, what our shared history is. So, in the interest of talking about Lockerbie, that this was a thing that happened. And there's a high chance you might not know that thing happened if it is not covered or considered to be newsworthy. So if we don't know this piece of information, we cannot even begin to move forward with how it affects us as a group, how we use it to categorize other people, and how important it is to us personally. We've already given some examples about categories and our understanding of people. If you have no interaction with somebody, then all the information you learn about the person in that category is what you learn from media. Right? It is a window into the world outside of our general day-to-day. It's also a frame. It tells us what's important. Right? So this is what you need to know. These are the characteristics and the categories and the information that you need to know. In the evolution from a category to a group, media can also inform what things are important, what those locomoting entities are, what your goals are as a member of this group, even though each and every one of us may have a very different understanding of what our group identities mean to us. All right, so for those of you who are first-generation college students, may have a very different interaction with your Syracuse identity than those of you who are legacy students who, generations have come to Syracuse. Those are very different experiences and very different understandings of the group. But one might argue the media that we consume tends to give us one understanding of that group, because that's the understanding that gets high ratings. That all Syracuse students love basketball, and that will always bring out ratings. Having said that, all of this information about different characteristics, categories, and groups can subsequently have an impact on our identity. The extent to which you begin to engage with a group, the extent to which that group is important to you, is often based on the mediated information that we get. Despite your own understanding of the group, the stories that are told, the stories that are apparently normal, in my class normal is a dirty word, the stories that are normal, or the stories that are important or newsworthy, have an impact on our identity, regardless of whether or not we adhere to them or believe them. So in this process of understanding Lockerbie, the individuals lost, as well as the Syracuse students lost, the fact that it has, I feel like every word I'm going to say is offensive, faded from what is determined to be newsworthy and public memory, it has an effect. It has an effect on when we talk about current race relations, international relations, religious relations, etc. If we're not thinking about this as a long-form narrative, because it's not considered to be newsworthy, then we can't have a solid understanding of ourselves and our identity. And that's an essential piece of where media fits into our public understandings of memory and our public understandings of ourselves. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Please give a round of applause to
Now for our next panelist, we have Lynn Jackson from Albany, New York. She's a co-founder of Project Salam, which stands for Support and Legal Advocacy for Muslims. Information on that can be found online. The project is salam.org. Lynn's involvement with the issue of preemptive prosecution began when two Muslim men in Albany named Yasin Arif and Muhammad Hussein were sentenced to 15 years in prison after being entrapped by the FBI. Lynn has worked to pass resolutions regarding the targeting of Muslims and organized a 133-mile walk to bring attention to Yasin Arif's case. Lynn wrote the database used in the report, Inventing Terrorists, the Lawfare of Preemptive Prosecution. Prior to her involvement in civil liberty issues, Lynn was a volunteer for a group called Save the Pine Brush, which is an organization instrumental in preserving the rare pine brush ecosystem located in Albany, New York. Lynn lives with her husband and 2 cats and makes a living as a computer consultant. We're happy to have her with us today.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Can everyone hear me? Okay, all right. My name is Lynn Jackson. I'm from Albany, and is it too loud? Oh, it's a little bit too loud. Yeah, let's try this. Oh my goodness. Is that better?
Yeah.
Can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm a volunteer with Project Salam. I very much appreciate being invited to be part of a Remembrance Week. It is very, very, is that, can you hear the echoing? No, there's something else.
There's the door.
Oh, the door, all right, sorry. It's not the microphone, good. It is very important to remember history, and I am very impressed with the extent of how formalized the memory of the tragedy of Pan Am has become at the university. I have been asked to speak about my experiences as a civil rights activist in the post-9/11 era and the relationship between the memorization of terrorist violence and Islamophobia, anti-Arab racism, post-9/11 media representation of Muslims and Arabs. Prior to 9/11, I limited my volunteer activities to working with an organization that sued municipalities to stop developments in the unique ecosystem called the Pine Bush. When 9/11 happened, I knew the world was going to change, but I did not know how. I did not speak out when Muslim men and boys were being made to register with the government, which happened right after 9/11. Since I didn't know any Muslims, this did not affect my life. When the oncologist, Dr. Rafael Defir, was arrested in Syracuse, New York in 2003, I knew that something was very wrong. But since this did not happen in my city, I did not speak out or get involved. In August 2004, a few blocks from my house in Albany, New York, the FBI raided the local mosque and arrested Imam Yasin Arif and local businessman Muhammad Hussein for terrorism. It seemed inconceivable to me that there were terrorists in Little Albany, New York. I thought this would quickly blow over, especially since in a few weeks the media had reported that the FBI had entered into evidence documents which were mistranslated. The trial for Yasin and Muhammad began in September 2006. I read everything in the papers about it. The reporters wrote articles that were almost laughing at the FBI because the entire case was so absurd. These articles, the reporters wrote it as if it was quite snarky kind of things because it just didn't make any sense. 2 local columnists followed the trial closely and wrote articles about the complete lack of evidence for prosecuting these men. When these 2 men were convicted in October, I was horrified. In March 2007, they were given sentences for 15 years. 15 years in prison. And I want to read something that the local columnist, the Daily Gazette columnist, Carl Strock said. He said it the best. He begins, I hang my head in shame. Yassin Aref and Mohammed Hussein, two local Muslim men who were minding their own business until the FBI came into their lives, have been convicted of supporting terrorism, of all things. Convicted of a jury of my peers, not necessarily their peers, but my peers, meaning ordinary, middle-class people from upstate New York who sat patiently for 12 days and listened to evidence that, in my opinion, was an embarrassment to our country, or should have been an embarrassment to our country, and then sat for another 3.5 days and discussed the evidence before arriving at their verdict. Guilty. Guilty of conspiring to do something that the two probably did not understand, that in any event had never dreamed of doing until an FBI undercover operative tricked them into it. And that they were so sure it was okay, they insisted on putting in writing. They were even found guilty of providing support to a terrorist organization fighting in Kashmir that one of them kept telling the FBI snitch, who was secretly recording everything, that he didn't know anything about, and that the other one thought was a musical group. Such is the fear of Muslim terrorism, I guess. Such is the irrationality that has seized us since the attacks of September 2001. Such is the determination not to take any chances. After their sentencing in March of 2007, I tossed a coin and I decided to write to Yassin Aref. Little did I understand at the time what was going on. I thought that the conviction was just a mistake and the men would win on appeal. I mean, how could the government use secret evidence in a trial? I couldn't understand this. And secret evidence was used in this trial. How could the government convict these men relying on an informant who lied on the stand? I couldn't understand this. It didn't make any sense. So I thought this was just a mistake of the government and it would be quickly rectified. So I decided to take a short detour away from the butterflies and sand dunes that I had been working on for 30 years, and I would just work on this issue for a short while and go back to my butterflies and sand dunes and preserving the pine bush. However, when Yassin lost his appeal on July 2nd, 2008, my world was shattered. I was in a state of shock. It was at that point I realized my world had completely changed since the horror of 9/11. At that point, others in the community came together to form Project Salam. By now, we had met people from other communities whose sons, brothers, fathers were convicted of terrorism in similar cases. Many of these cases involve the use of informants, or, as the case of Rafil Dafir here in Syracuse, the raising of funds for charity, food, hospitals, medicine, schools. The issue of Dr. Dafir is very important, and I hope we can talk about it more during the discussion, but he essentially was given 22 years in prison for giving charity to Iraqi children. So what Project Salam did is we looked at what is the issue, what is going on here, and we came up and we looked at the concept of preemptive prosecution. And I think this really, when I hear Cherie speak about groups, I feel like this is really part of the whole issue because we look at Muslims as being the other, and that is what allows this to happen. So what is preemptive prosecution? Preemptive prosecution, also called preventive, predatory, proactive, pretextual, or manufactured prosecution, is a law enforcement strategy that was adopted after 9/11 to target and prosecute individuals or organizations whose beliefs, ideology, or religious affiliations raise security concerns for the government. The actual criminal charges are pretexts manufactured by the government to incarcerate the targets for their beliefs, not for what they did, but for what they believe. These pretexts include using material support for terrorism laws to criminalize activities that are otherwise not criminal, such as free speech, free association, charity, peacemaking, and social hospitality. Using conspiracy laws to treat friendships and organizations as criminal conspiracies, and their members are as guilty by association, even when most members of the group have not been involved in any criminal activity and may not be aware of it. Using agents provocateur to actively entrap targets in criminal plots manufactured and controlled by the government. Using minor technical crimes, which otherwise would not have been prosecuted or even discovered, in order to incarcerate individuals for their ideology, for their beliefs, instead of for something they actually did. The targeting of nonviolent individuals because the government believes that they represent a potential for violence is precisely what preemptive prosecution is all about. In preemptive prosecution, the targets are prosecuted with fake, manufactured, or pretext charges to preempt them from developing their, quote, potential for violence. Our database, unfortunately, has over 1,000 people who have been targeted by the government in this manner, many of whom have been given long or even life sentences. This is a study. It's called Inventing Terrorists. We published it in 2014. It is available free online for anyone who would like to read it or discuss it, analyze it. So what is this study? So the Department of Justice published a list of individuals that it claimed represented all of the terrorism and terrorism-related convictions in the U.S. from September 11, 2001 to March 18, 2010. We analyzed these cases, and we discovered that the statistical analysis shows that 72.4% of these convictions of the 400 people were based on the suspicion of the defendant's perceived ideology and not on his criminal history or activity. Not on his criminal activity. Another 21.8% of the convictions on the DOJ list represent people who began on their own to engage in minor, non-terrorist criminal activity, but whose cases were manipulated and inflated by the government to appear as if they were terrorists. These cases are referred to in the study as elements of preemptive prosecution. So overall, 94.2% of all the terrorism cases, terrorism-related convictions on the Department of Justice list have either been preemptive prosecution or cases that involved elements of preemptive prosecution. So most of what we have this background in the media, there's always this drumbeat in the media. You see it all the time. Oh, this young Muslim man was arrested for terrorism. And they talk about what a big case it was, and if you read halfway down the article, you realize there was an FBI informant. As soon as you see FBI informant, you know it's a fake case. So why is this happening? And also, let's look at the continuum. According to Human Rights First, because Guantanamo, of course, figures into this too, 8 detainees who have been kept at Guantanamo have been convicted in military courts. Remember, a total of 780 men have gone through Guantanamo, have been held at Guantanamo at one time or another. And of those, only 8 have been convicted of a crime in a military court. To us, we look at Guantanamo as the worst end of the spectrum. And what we deal with is, Guantanamo is it's not here in the US, it's in Cuba. But we look at cases that happen in the United States. And so the United States has these special prisons. Has anyone heard of these prisons called communication management units? Guess not, okay. So these are called, these units, they're abbreviated CMU, communication management units. So we call them little gitmos. And these are extremely restrictive prisons, and most of the inmates, most of them are Muslim. even though Muslims represent a tiny, tiny fraction of the entire prison population. Almost all the people in these communication management units are Muslim. And the conditions in these prisons are absolutely horrific. Yassine Aref was sent to the CMU in Terre Haute, Indiana, and from prison, he wrote a letter called Dead Life in a Political Prison, which describes some of the prison conditions. His letter is not for the faint of heart. In March of 2011, he was transferred out of the CMU, and we believe that he was transferred out because he sued the Bureau of Prisons over the challenge, the Bureau of Prisons' constitutionality of the communication management units, and he just won that lawsuits. I believe that Muslims are targeted because people see them as the other. We label them domestic Islamic terrorists. However, our study shows that there are almost no domestic Islamic terrorists in this country. Instead, the FBI keeps inventing terrorists. You know, they keep on doing these cases. And I'm not too sure exactly why, but I think it is a whole lot easier to invent a sting case, to control everything, to entice someone to do something or say something wrong, than it is to actually go out and find some criminals. If you look at the recent cases, there are almost always a paid FBI informant involved. And some of these FBI informants are paid a lot of money. I looked at one case in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, called the Fort Dix Five, and the two informants in that case were paid a total of $400,000. When one of the neighbors of one of the men who was arrested told me this, I said I could not believe the government paid $400,000 to two informants to entrap these five men. And I didn't believe it until I looked on the government's website and looked at the government's Excel spreadsheets that detail all of those expenses. I thought it was shocking. The FBI sends FBI informants into mosques to surveil members of the mosque. As an American, I find this to be so offensive. After all, what is the first phrase of the First Amendment to the Constitution? It is freedom of religion, not freedom of speech. And why is it freedom of religion and not freedom of speech? Why is that the first phrase in the First Amendment to the Constitution? It's because we cannot have freedom of speech until we can have freedom of our own thoughts. And we must be free to be able to have our own thoughts. The idea that our government sends informants into places of worship is simply anti-American. Because a few members, one or a few members of a particular group of people commit a crime, no matter how horrific, this does not mean people in that group will commit similar crimes. The targeting of Muslims in this country and these so-called terror cases are being used to justify the wars abroad. And I think that we don't know who the terrorists are here. We just don't have this problem that the government says we are, that we're fighting people overseas. And I think that we need to look at these issues because I think we need to look at how to create peace as opposed to how to get people to be involved in violence at all. And I think that we need to look at the wars overseas, and we need to look at what we're doing here. So I think, I just want to say one more thing, that because you are here in Syracuse, my hope is that you will learn a lot about Dr. Rafael DeFeer's case. And one of his supporters is sitting in the second row in the middle, Catherine Hughes, and I'm sure that at some point afterwards she would be delighted to speak with you about Dr. DeFeer.
I don't know how you why don't you go ahead? I have all these notes.
No, let's get the discussion started. Let's go.
Okay, I just wanted to add a couple of thoughts, just listening to you. And again, most of my thoughts are about So I'll just, the concept of preemptive prosecution just screams to me pre-crime, right? It's Minority Report, and why is the report got to be minority? Never mind, I think that's funny. This pre-crime, this idea that we will capture you based on either what the sentient beings in the pool have said, for those of you familiar with the body of Tom Cruise work, but that there's this idea that we can figure out what's happening. And there is a lot of work looking at the problems with big data analysis, right? Broken windows policing, especially within specifically poor Black communities in the US. But this idea that, well, all the terrorists that came before were of Muslim descent, therefore, it's totally going to work. This is a viable map. But there's study after study after study that shows if you're basing all of your data on problematic racialized thinking for centuries, then you will get problematized, racialized results. So that was it's just one of those things that always gets me, you know. And Minority Report was a 1999 movie, and we're still very much in that narrative. And I say this explicitly because a big part of media is not telling you everything you need to know, right? You can't even if we have 24-hour news, you technically can't learn everything. But more importantly, you learn what's newsworthy. And the connections between our stereotypical assumptions of people and what people will tune in to watch creates this cycle of information. So when we talk about terrorism, we use that word specifically to address people from Muslim communities, right? We haven't talked, I was reading some news story, you guys are familiar with Kansas City, that these 3 men were busted before they could launch a post-election day attack on a predominantly Somali apartment complex, or an apartment complex with predominantly Somali refugees, and it was 3 white men. And we've had more white Christian extremism, domestic terrorism in the US over the past 20 years than we've had what we deem Muslim terrorism. So, but that doesn't make for good ratings, right? It's just not going to bring people in, so we keep regurgitating these same stories. While at the same time, we're in a space where I need to tell you this story and sensationalize this story that is part of media industry. And the most heartbreaking thing for me, and I remember, I was a junior in college on 9/11, it was in Boston. But for me, in 2005 is when I started doing my dissertation and thinking through the kind of work that I wanted to do. And at the time, there were riots across Paris, in Clichy-sous-Bois, and a lot of Muslim ghettoized enclaves. And by ghettoized, I mean explicitly being forced to live in a space. Not, you know, I hate the way the word ghetto has evolved, but actual ghettoized enclaves of a lot of first-generation young men of North African Muslim descent that couldn't get work, right? Were just being completely ostracized from the community. Riots broke out, and Paris was burning for 30 days or so. Because one young man was running from the police, I believe, ran into a power grid or wires and died. So that's how those started. 10 years later, to the month, were the attacks on the Bataclan in Paris. And I remember watching these stories, knowing fully well that 10 years earlier, there had been a serious uprising in this community, and that was never part of the conversation. There was no connect the dots in this space, even though that's what we hope journalists will do. How did we get to hear from here and here and here? How did we not talk about Battle of Algiers when we're talking about this? Because it's not good ratings. What makes for good ratings are reiterating what viewers already think they know. And in that space, we get back to this regurgitated sense of, I know what that person is. I know what that person does. I know the indicators of that category. But in reality, we don't. We only know what gets good ratings. I'll stop there. I got so many other things.
I just want to follow up for one thing when you say, like who, the category of terrorism.
Mhm.
And I think one of the issues is who is a terrorist? Because when you think about it, who shot those 20 little school children in Connecticut and the 6 teachers, right? He was not a Muslim man, therefore we don't know what religion he was, because unless someone who does an act like this, if they're not a Muslim, they're not identified by their religion, they're identified as being mentally ill. And he's also not identified as a terrorist. And I think an act like that is terrorism, but it's not identified that way. And I think that is one of the other issues that we see, is that Muslims are given if Muslims do horrific acts like that, they're given the label of terrorist. But if they're young white men doing it who are not Muslim, they don't get that label.
And 2 points I would say. There's one thing you said that was, Guantanamo was our worst. And I had to write a note down because we do like to talk about that as what happened over there, those bad actors. But for those of you who are familiar with the Milgram and the Zimbardo experiments from 1950s and 1970s, know that we are all capable of doing that, right? So Milgram was just post-World War II and asked people to shock. They took the role of teacher, and you were asked to shock a student when they got a question wrong, the student who was in another room. And every time they got the question wrong, you were supposed to increase the shock. And there was a man in a lab coat, white man in a lab coat, telling you, please continue, even though the student on the other side is saying, it hurts, please stop, I have a heart condition, and eventually stops responding. Half the people in that scenario continued to shock the student, even though there was no response. It's worthwhile to note that it's half, right? Half did not continue to do that, but half did. And in the case of Zimbardo, that's the Stanford experiment where they took college-age men and made some of them prisoners and some of them guards and put them in a basement. And this was supposed to be a 2-week experiment to see how hierarchy and status affected group relations. That study was canceled after 5 days because the guards became so physically violent with the prisoners that the whole experiment had to end. So when we say that Guantanamo is our worst on the spectrum, that is also a cognitive strategy. That we say that's what they're doing, I would never do that. But study after study after study shows that in the right scenario, we have a very high chance of doing these things. And if we're not aware or realize that what they're doing is also what we might do, then we don't get to engage with that information about ourselves. We say, oh, that's what they're doing. We're not them. So I don't need to think about it.
And I think that's a great opportunity to ask this question. So it's really clear that the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 has really irrevocably shaped our campus community identity. It's impossible to ignore. And similarly, there's this narrative of resilience and defense that emerged out of 9/11, which really contributed to things like the Patriot Act and this consistent FBI entrapment. So I'm curious, how are community identities, national identities, so we've been talking a lot about the other and othering Muslims and Arabs specifically, but I'm curious if we flip that around, how are our national identities or even nationalism itself connected to our collective memories of traumatic or terroristic events? Either one of you.
Well, I would say immediately that our national identity is based on not being them, whomever them is, right? That it's not just that we live in this space. It's not that we are in this latitude, in this longitude, and this geographic space, but that this space, this identity, is not this other identity. And key terms, social comparison theory and out-group, in-group relations would say that we construct our identities not only about who we are, Because we can talk about who we are. We are a nation of immigrants, right? We, give us your huddled masses. That's who we are. But at the same time, we are not them. And then that gets integrated into this narrative of who we are. So I think it's impossible to have that conversation to say it's A or B, because at any given time it's the same thing. At the same time, we are a Christian nation, right? So we can pick and choose these words that we understand about who we are, but at the very least, we in the United States are not, you know, monarchists, right? That was the construction of American identity, escaping monarchy and British rule. So just from the crux of who the United States is, comes from not being something else. I don't even think I answered your question.
That was totally.
Yeah, so just going off of some of the conversations that you guys were touching upon, especially how when we have these events happening, and you mentioned the shooting in Connecticut and how we don't know the religious identity of that person. There are other events where the religious identity of the person is noted or found out. For instance, the Oklahoma City bombing. And I remember I was an elementary school kid watching the news with my parents, and all of a sudden they announced a Muslim name. That was the first thing that they found out. And I was so sad by that. And then later on the investigation continued, and we found out that there was someone named Timothy McVeigh who did propose himself to have some religious background for his actions. However, thankfully, the media and the world and the United States did not go attack his religious group or organization. Similar thing happened in Norway when that person did the biggest terrorist attack, and unfortunately I cannot pronounce his name, but it was labeled as the biggest terrorist attack in Norway. And a huge, I don't know how many, 50-page or more manual was found where he was claiming a religious pretext to his event. Yet news media's specific one, and I will not mention it, I'm sure we can all guess, or some can guess, went out and said, just because this person claims to be of a particular faith does not mean he is of that particular faith. Well, some months ago, an event happened in Fort Hood, the Fort Hood shooting, and the person claimed to be a Muslim and said, that same media outlet said, yes, this person is a Muslim. So this concept of grouping and all that, how do you address, or how do you think the media is addressing it, and what can be done to improve that, if anything?
Well, I'll just say really quickly, I show in class a compilation of the Oklahoma City bombing news media coverage like immediately after. And you see just news out, and this is pre-24-hour news, although CNN was up in 1980, but Fox, MSNBC, Al Jazeera were all 1996. So when you watch it, so this is broadcast network news talking about how this has all the markings of a Muslim bombing, right? That they're regurgitating this narrative, and then when they find out it's Timothy McVeigh, they're like, well, we were just repeating what the government told us. And it's appalling in that moment, because, we like to think, oh, this is a new phenomenon, but it isn't, right? That this is the story that's newsworthy, is the story we're already familiar with. And that's what will bring in ratings.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that I think this is what bothers me so much is that these horrific killings, these shootings that happen all the time. Like, for example, I was brought up as a Unitarian Universalist, and my church started a program called Standing on the Side of Love. I don't know if anyone's heard of it. And so what is that? It's because in Tennessee, a man went into a Unitarian Universalist church on a Sunday morning during the children's choir and began shooting people. And the church members were able to stop him, but many people died. So in the news media, he actually specifically said that he targeted the Unitarians because he wanted to kill liberals. And this is what the shooter said. But you don't ever see that. We don't know, for example, I have no idea what kind of religious faith he is. I don't know what political party he was involved with. I don't know any of that stuff. And the reason, does he have a microphone? So, but the thing is that it is this making of the other, that the Muslim religion in some way is different from, oh, all these Christians over here. So if Christian people, or people who don't have a faith, or people who are whatever religion or non-religion they are, we're not going to tell you what that is, because that's irrelevant. But if they're Muslim, they must have done it because they were Muslim. Which is, I find that, as an American, to be particularly offensive.
So, this is going off a brief conversation that we had prior to the start of the panel, and that I'm really interested in following up on. I want to hear about our relationship to these past events, to all the many things that we brought up, to our contemporary conversations in American and European political arenas. So I'm talking about the refugee crisis, our election, things like that. How do you see these memories and our conceptualization of terrorism playing a part of that?
I'll just make one point before we come to answer that, is especially when we talk about media representation and our understanding of certain groups, is that I invite you to think when the last time you saw a news story that featured a Muslim individual that was not about terrorism or was not about migrants, which has been tied to terrorism, right? That the fact that those stories are few and far between are inherently a problem. I'm a big fan, I don't know how other people feel about it, but there was this fun little viral video going around for a while called Mipsters. And it was, Muslim women in America riding skateboards. I don't know if there's a hula in there. There's definitely a lot of skateboard riding and like looking fabulous by the car, like, straight up selfie kind of stuff. And I just loved it because we have this space of taking back the image, right? This is my image, whatever your image is, this is mine. And I have a camera in my pocket and I'm going to tell my story. And I don't have to wait for someone else to say, oh, your story is worthwhile covering. People will watch your story. But the fact that we don't tell other stories of these individuals, or we can talk about any given group, right? Who gets the variety and diversity of stories? Who gets to be the hero and the anti-hero? Who gets to be all of the things, because we are all everything that came before and everything that comes after. But we only see certain stories when it comes to certain groups. And how that ties to our current environment, media is about ratings, and elections are popularity contests. Contrary to what anybody tells you, they're literally popularity contests. So, this same process, if this is what you're looking for, the minute someone offers it to you, you gravitate towards that. And that goes in any direction.
I think one of the things that bothers me so much about this is that you are absolutely right about how Muslims are only shown in the media as related to terrorism. And like some of the related Muslims to terrorism is that when one of these attacks happen, that the media or people, the media will go to the local mosque or whatever and say, well, how do you feel about it? As if Muslims need to apologize because somebody 1,000 miles away shot up a nightclub in Florida. It's like when people, I've never been asked to apologize for white people doing horrible things to people, but to ask Muslims to apologize for some kind of terrorist act is absurd. It's like they have nothing to do with it. But why are you asking this? On the flip side, though, in Albany, of course, this is not mass media, but it is local media. We are the group that formed to support the families of Yassin Araf and Mohammed Hussein after they were convicted. And don't worry, they're safely in prison. I'm sorry. But we support their families. The group is called the Muslim Solidarity Committee. And every year, on August 4th or thereabouts, we have some kind of observation of the anniversary of their arrests in Albany. And we either have a march, or we show a movie, or we have some kind of very public event. And I will say that the media does come out for it, because I think a lot of people, especially people who were in Albany all those years ago really know that these men were innocent if they were railroaded into prison, and that it is a plot on Albany that these men were arrested and incarcerated. So I think it is possible. We also have had events just recently. The Veterans for Peace and we have a new group called the Coalition Against Islamophobia. We got together and held a voter registration during the Friday prayer at the local mosque. And I felt that the man who was from the Veterans for Peace felt that this was a really radical act to publicize, making sure that the Muslims in the area were registered to vote. And we actually got media coverage of this event, which was pretty cool, and clearly had nothing to do with terrorism. So we do try. In Albany, we have had some other events. We also did an event that some people thought was kind of controversial. One of our big, we have this huge festival every year in Albany, and we had a table, we called it Ask a Muslim. And so many Muslim women came in and sat at the table, and we had conversations with the passersby, and it was really very fun. And I think part of the issue is that there are so few Muslims in terms of percentage of the population, and that a lot of non-Muslims simply don't know any Muslims, and just saying hello to somebody can make all the difference in the world.
That's called the social contact hypothesis. All for 1954. That by simply coming into contact with people for whom you only have, socialized stereotypes and media constructs is theorized to be and often shown to be one of the best ways to break those stereotypes. There is a role for media to play, but there's also a bigger role in interpersonal interactions. Yeah,
I didn't know that it was a social construct.
key term.
I'd like to take a moment to try and loop back around to where we started. Which is Remembrance Week, Pan 1 and 3. And this is a hard question to ask because so much has changed since 1988 with the internet, that's a big deal. And then many different aspects of media coverage. The way that we walk around in a post-9/11 world is very different from the pre-9/11 world. A lot of things around transportation and things like that have changed. That being said, I'd like to try and throw this question out there and see if there's traction. How do you think that our memories of 9/11 are informed by those of 9/11 and vice versa? How, as a campus community, as a national community, if you want to call it that, how are our memories of these two events informing each other? What are the connections? Dr. LaCree, you referenced sort of this larger narrative that isn't really referenced when we talk about terrorism in retrospect, or other groups in retrospect. So that's the question.
I actually was going to share a personal story. Actually, it's not that personal, but I remember after 9/11, the very first time I flew after 9/11, and I've been flying since before I could remember. My family's from the West Indies, so I would go back and forth as a child. But I remember going to the airport a month after 9/11 and seeing fully armed security with M16s. M16s is the Marine issue. Strapped walking around the airport. And I just remember being floored that this was our new normal. And I did an art project, college student, great art project, where I constructed a false M16 and put a buddy of mine in Marine gear and had him walk around the student center and saw what happened. And he got a couple, double takes, but nobody questioned his presence. So how does this connect to prior experiences? This is one of the largest on American soil, right? Because that's the thing about Lockerbie is it wasn't on American soil. And like I said, I can't remember what I was doing in 1988. probably saw changes. I think that was probably when you couldn't walk up to the gate anymore to collect your family. So if you guys remember, you used to be able to walk up to the gate even if you didn't have a ticket to meet your family when they got off the plane. I think around 1988, 1989 is when that was no longer an option. So I would argue the way we talk about one and the other is talking about the reverberating effect and our understanding of what it means to be safe, what it means to travel. After 9/11, you know, you couldn't wear shoes or carry more than 3 ounces of liquid, right? That we're in this new normal. But there was definitely a shift as well around Lockerbie in the late 80s, when you could no longer do these things. There was no longer an opportunity to, that travel was forever changed. And I think that understanding, or excuse me, the narrative that we have to give up something so that we can get something else, be it safety, security, what have you, and we do love safety, human need, right? You can always play on safety. You can get people to give up some things in the interest of safety. And I think that that is what happens time and time and time again. But we don't necessarily stop to think about it time and time again because it's what needs to happen right now. That's my thought.
That's interesting. I mean, you know, I lived in Albany, so it's a little different. We didn't, there were people in Albany who were killed in that flight. But, you know, my recollection is more that, you know, back then, airplanes used to crash every now and then. There was many more airplane crashes back then, big, you know, big planes, you know, 100 people, 200 people would die. That it wasn't such an outlier, except of course it was a deliberate act of murder. And I don't, like people, and there would be articles in the paper about the people who died at Lockerbie, but it was not, I think, the same as here, where 35 people went to a particular university, which is pretty significant. So for me, I thought we still could go to the, I don't know, I didn't really fly much, so.
I just remember because I was an unaccompanied minor, so there was always a point when my mother could go all the way up to the gate to drop me off and collect me, and then around, I think, 90, 91,
Oh, okay, all right,
that was
makes
no
sense.
longer an option.
That makes sense, yeah. But surely after 9/11, the travel things are completely different. I mean, it used to be you get on a train, you know, you didn't have to show ID, you didn't have to do anything. You just got on a train and you paid your money and that was it. And now, you know, they want to see your ID and they want to see this and that other nonsense.
Remember when you could go to Canada without a passport?
Yeah, that's why I've been to Canada since. It's like, I have to go get a passport. Which I've not done yet. Yeah, I mean, it was just much, people were less suspicious. And I look at this militarization, I think what really got me is when I read in the paper that Albany High School was going to require metal detectors. And I thought, oh please, you know, bad enough you go to City Hall now and you have to go through the metal detector. But to have this kind of what I would call security theater, because I think it is security theater. And I just think it's overwhelming that we train people that it's okay to have your privacy, you know, violated in this way. I always used to carry a Swiss Army knife with me because you need a tool like that. You need a pair of scissors and the tweezers and all that stuff that comes with a Swiss Army knife. And once they started instituting metal detectors at City Hall, because I was always suing the city, I was always going down there, it became really a bother because I couldn't bring my Swiss Army knife anymore. And now I don't carry one anymore. It was so convenient. But you know, every now and then it would get confiscated, which I found extremely irritating. So I will admit I experimented a lot with how to get my Swiss Army knife in without anyone noticing. And actually, I did actually do that once because early on when you had cell phones could start to take pictures, they didn't want them to take pictures in the county buildings. Like, I can't imagine why. I was going to the county records building, like, who cares? Somebody take pictures of their records anyway. They were so upset about that. I have a little secret pocket in my knapsack, and I put my Swiss Army knife parallel to my cell phone so that maybe if it went through the metal detector right, they wouldn't be able to see it. And so they were really upset about this cell phone. Does it take pictures? Does it take pictures? But they didn't see this was sorry night.
I think another point that I think is worth mentioning, right? So I talk in my class, I ask the students to think, how do we know a life matters? And I just kind of want to bring this back to how we celebrate these lives here versus this larger issues. And you know, how do we know a life matters? Well, we know a life matters if your life is remembered. We know a life matters if somebody knows that, you know, you need help, or that you can drink fresh water, or that, you know, you can send your children to school. Like, there are all these things that help us realize that a life matters. So the practice of 35 scholars, each affiliated with another life, to learn about and engage with that person is essential. At what point are we having, and I appreciate that we're having this conversation right now. I'll also point out I've only been here 3 years, so I apologize if I'm not as deeply aware of the remembrance process. But you know, in that space where we remember those that we lost, I'm not saying that that's not valuable. But the context, this is a question for you. How do we remember those that we lost, and then how we lost them? Are those, and by how I mean this whole long conversation that we're having right now, are those mutually exclusive in the process of remembrance scholars? Are they integrated? How does that work?
Yeah, they're definitely not mutually exclusive. And I think that comes to life in the Remembrance motto, which is look back, act forward, which this year, one of the ways it's manifested is in this panel to have this conversation. In the past, it hasn't always manifested as this kind of conversation. But there's always definitely some sort of conversation around narratives of terrorism, whether or not it's a critical one or one that's more of a dominant narrative. It varies from year to year, and it really is subject to the particular group of scholars of that year, what kind of events they want to do, what their experiences are, and so thus it's also subject to what kind of political investments they're bringing to the table and things like that. But it's a very mediated process, and there's nothing apolitical about that. Whether or not it's obvious or not is another question.
Right, and the reason I bring that up is because when we talk about, for example, we, for, you know, years we were talking about saying the names at 9/11, right? And whether or not that was an anti-war sentiment, that we couldn't remember those that we lost without making a political commentary. The draped coffins coming back from war. For me, again, like I said, 2005 is really where I started attaining a real political awareness in media. We were deep in the Iraq and Afghan wars, and the PBS NewsHour started airing pictures of fallen soldiers when the pictures became available and their names became available in silence at the end of every single broadcast. And so at the end of every single broadcast, every day, I would sit there, whatever I was doing, because you know you do other things while the news are on, I would stop, and I would watch, and I would listen, and I would take the, and like, it got real rough, because then they started getting younger than me, and it was really hard. But, you know, PBS NewsHour was dragged for that, because they were like, oh, this is anti-war, you have a political statement. So in this space of remembering those we lost, and a larger socio-cultural understanding of what's happening and how they were lost is often framed as mutually exclusive, which is why I was kind of curious as to how that operates in this space on this campus with this event.
We're running a little bit behind, and we wanted to save some time for some audience questions as well. And either Ahmed or I will come around and hand folks the mic. But this is the opportunity. Any questions for either or both of the panelists? I'll speak now for opportunities.
It's all right, Farrell, I can talk loud. Both of you have said something that I'm a newspaper reader still, and it frequently bothers me the adjectives that are used to describe events or people, because they can be very prejudicial. It's a two-part question, and one is there any hope ever of actually having independent and accurate and non-prejudicial news media the way I think of it, newspaper, radio, TV? And the second part is, does our cell phone and all of our other stuff that we use and all of the social media that is happening, does that give us any hope that we will have a more fair reporting of events and people?
You want to go first?
So I think that's a very good question. I, of course, am a big fan of Democracy Now!, which I think is one of the more fair news reporting. In terms of, I think that whoever reports the news is always going to have a bias because we all have biases. I just don't think you can ever take it out. My hope that, how do I put this? I just, the reason I think Democracy Now! is more, reports the news more accurately is that when I listen to it, the voices on Democracy Now! Are extremely varied. There's many, 100,000 of different voices that you hear on Democracy Now! The more different voices, the more different points of view. If you listen to regular media, they usually have like one or two commenters, and it's all the same kind of talking heads, as opposed to something like Democracy Now! In terms of the social media, I mean, this idea of the cell phone that everybody has in their pocket, the ability to film anything, is really kind of, it's still mind-blowing to me that, it used to be a video camera was an extremely expensive and cumbersome, difficult. Oh yeah, these things, they were hard to carry around. And so I have hope that, I have a lot of hope that more truth will come out because there's just more voices out there, and everybody has, oh well, not everybody with means has access to these little devices in our pockets.
I would say yes, that there is hope, but that hope comes from every single person being aware, seeing that language, demanding more, choosing media consciously, right? So in the end, media companies, I do my best not to blame media companies because we're living in a cycle where everything is, a for-profit industry. So we vote, but we also vote with our dollars. And if we're not actively voting with our dollars, then we will continue to drift towards this hegemonic norm where certain stories get valued. On that note, I will throw out another citation for coded language, right? Because that's what you're describing here, is coded language, that certain groups get described in a certain way. And that is Goff 2008 did a content analysis of newspapers from, let's go with 2005 to 2007 or so, and found that black suspects were more likely to be described using primal adjectives, so animalistic, right? These words that are coded and have a long history of coding and continuing to stereotype black Americans. We see it in the newspapers, still very present. So again, at what point is any one of those journalists doing it intentionally or doesn't know that this is a problem and that they are more likely to report one person like this and one person like this? Until we are fully aware of all of our biases and are willing to acknowledge them, then this gets reinforced without a second thought and doesn't get called out. And two other things I'll tell you. There's another key term called the hostile media bias, which basically shows that the more polarized you are, the more likely you are to see neutral media coverage as against your side. So if we even say Democracy Now! Is neutral, or they present as much as they can, if you are far on the ends, you will look at that neutral one, be it far liberal, far conservative, whatever, you will look at that neutral news content and say, they're against me. So this is another psychological process where we can't even begin to appreciate news coverage that is neutral or unbiased or equivalent, because we have this psychological identity with our political biases that causes us to see neutral content as against us. And with respect to the cell phone and digital, absolutely, more information, more information, more information. Having said that, our brain only handles so much more information. But what does give me hope, and I'll cite one more paper, is Min and Feaster. And they found that there was a racial disparity in the news coverage of missing children. And that is to say that white children went missing, let's see, I'm trying to remember what the exact numbers were. White children, I believe, went missing at about 50 to 55% of missing cases from the FBI, but accounted for about 65 to 70 cases, 65 to 70% of the news coverage of missing cases. So they were overrepresented. Again, how do we know a life matters, right? If you go missing, is anybody looking for you? But what gives me hope is, and it's so sad, again, none of my fun facts are fun, but it does give me hope that I don't see who gets selected for the milk carton anymore. That if somebody's loved one has gone missing, that's what I see in my feed. And that's what pops up. And I know that even if this person is not covered in the news, is not covered on a milk carton, I don't even know if they do milk cartons anymore, but is not in the mainstream news, I'm getting a notification with a picture. And if I see that little girl or that little boy, then at least I have some cognitive note that that child is missing. And that's one of the things that it gets me every time whenever I see those. And I have to reshare them because there's a child missing. And we have the abilities in our pockets to make sure that everybody gets that face.
I can also be loud. You mentioned that the U.S. as a nation is partially built on othering ourselves. Do you think that's unique to us, or do you think that's part of the human idea of grouping a nation? And if so, how do we move away from that?
I definitely don't think it's unique to us. I think that's a human tendency. And how we move away from it is to acknowledge that it is a human tendency and that we all tend to do it. I'll go back to discussions of French diversity, right? Again, I got into research because during those riots in 2005, there were no brown people on French TV, period, right? So they had this large community, but the idea was, oh, well, don't wear a headscarf, that's not French. Right, that this idea that what is French is somehow not that, even though liberté, fraternité, etc. So for me, my understanding of the U.S. has always been informed by going back and forth from Guyana and back to the States. But to also see, and I play the clips from France during that time for my students now, and they're like, oh, that's exactly what we're talking about now. Right, so my opinion is it's a human tendency, and the only way to overcome human tendencies is to see them and call them out when we see them. In ourselves and in others. Sorry, I got to.
No, that was excellent. Excellent answer.
Yes. Would you like to?
No, can you hear me? So I think this is a question, I don't know. I was thinking about how we turn social contact with people who are not like you into education, because my experience with interacting, I teach math in the city of Syracuse, and with coworkers that are really white. So I get a lot of, basically what they're saying is, I'm surprised you have a personality. I'm surprised you are not what I thought you were going to be. And so it turns into this kind of well, I still think this about a group of people, except you, my friend.
You're one of the good ones.
Yes, or not you, of course, that I'm talking about, but, and it's the same thing, because then, going into the school system, my students, who are mostly black and brown, walk through metal detectors once every 2 weeks the centuries search through bags of 12-year-old boys and like how do you? So you're there, you're seeing what's happening, but how do you link? Okay, you come into contact with these people now. Educate yourself.
I'll let you go first, because that is literally the work that you are doing.
That's a very hard question, which I've actually spent a lot of time thinking about. I grew up in Lily White, Endicott, New York. I don't know if you've ever heard of Endicott outside of Binghamton. There were virtually no people of color at all, anywhere. And when I came to Albany, I came to go to school in Albany, New York at the time when they began to integrate the public universities. And so I began to meet people from, the Bronx and downstate, or people from Puerto Rico who I had absolutely no understanding with. And I realized that I got involved in the environmental movement, which is a totally lily white movement. And I often wonder, well, why is that? And I often ask myself now this question because, how do we really truly form community with people who are not different from us? There was a time when I knew nothing about Muslims at all whatsoever, and I would never have even thought about speaking to a woman in a hijab, thinking that she was so different from me that I wouldn't be able to talk to her. And now, of course, I realize that, we're all people, and, I spend time in my Muslim friends' homes and with their kids and marching in the streets with them. But I also realize that we often talk about intersectionality. So us old white activists sit around and talk about intersectionality. And sometimes we think, well, why don't people from Black Lives Matter come and join with us, with this thing? And it's because what we really need to do is go spend time with them. We need to go to their groups and their activities and meet them. And we need to go and interact. And yet, to do all this takes an incredible amount of time. Because we really do need to spend time in other people's homes and to meet people and to really talk to each other. But I think it's a very difficult thing to do. And unfortunately, I don't have a lot of answers. Oh, except they'll march in the street. I think that we all have to go together, and we need to, when there's a Black Lives Matter protest, we have to go out and join them because they are being targeted in this country today. If there are other kinds of anti-war movement, all of these things, and we need to try to go to other people's events and other people's movements, but it's very hard to do.
I would say, also what you're describing is, in my opinion, an abundance of microaggressions, right? That it's like, you're cool, but everybody else that dresses the way you dress or looks the way you do that I don't know is not cool. And so at any given point, you are perpetually begging or asking somebody to think differently, and you become this ambassador. And I say that not because that's a bad thing, but we are also having an extensive discussion about self-healing and self-care. So I completely agree, you should totally march, but I will also say I've never protested. I've never gone out in the street and marched. And I don't do that because I have to protest in the classroom every single day. Professors don't look like me. Professors are not young women of color. What? No. Right? So, right off the bat, from the minute I walk into the classroom and I'm about to talk about how everybody's a little bit racist and nobody wants to hear about how everybody's a little bit racist, right? That it's a battle every single day. So I try and give all my students tools with which they can have these small interactions and maybe, pebble in a pond, right? And these ripples go out. So my immediate response to you is thank you. Thank you for the work you do. I hope you find time and space for self-healing and that you have a community who you can go back and be like, can you believe what this so-and-so said? Right? That is also important. But I would also invite you to have these conversations, even if you're teaching math, right? We've already talked about how the math can be problematic. That if you just provide a little bit to your colleagues and ask them to think about something differently, or your students, again, I'm not saying that you have to, become a race professor, but if we all do a little something, and we all think a little bit deeper and write a letter to the editor when we see coded language, and we all, stop when we hear a child use a word that is flippant. We're talking about sexuality at the moment in class, this narrative of, oh, that's so gay, for meaning bad things, right? That if we just say, hey, that's kind of screwed up, and here's why, and that person may then tell the next person, and that person may then tell the next person, and that might be too hopeful, and that might be idealistic, but that is what I have to believe. And I believe I Have Stone is at the top of my class website, said, if you plan to live long enough to see the outcomes of your actions, then you have asked too small of a question.
Thank you very much. We're really running short on time. We have time for one more brief question.
Okay. I went to a Justice for All event a couple weeks ago, and one of the panelists said, we don't need allies, we need freedom fighters. And I think that's a reference to everything, not just, being a Black person, not just being, whatever issues, the issues in society that have been put against us, being Muslim, being, a Black person, being Hispanic, things like that. And
injustice anywhere isn't injustice everywhere.
So,
There's no threat to justice.
the people that do need to be informed about the educator and these issues and these problems tend to not be the people at the desk. How do you get them to, focus on these issues and, try to educate them just a little bit because clearly this is a event where people should be out.
Sure.
But
Preaching to the choir.
they're not. And I was the same with the Justice event also. So it's just how do you get the conversation going?
Well, I would say on a lighter note, there's been a lot of conversation about satire. I was just teaching a satire class as well. And there's a great article, I think it was Vox, talking about how, SNL can threaten Trump, but Samantha Bee or Amy Schumer do not, because they are preaching to the choir, even though they have really relevant observations to make. But one thing that it said, and something that I've also been a fan of, is it gives you the tools and the phrasing with which to talk to other people. So, we're not watching John Oliver to change minds, or, if everybody watching John Oliver is already part of the John Oliver choir, then he's not changing minds. But he is giving you a statement, a statistic, a fact that you can then go out and engage with others. And in that Injustice for All and all of these events, we are finding support in being around each other and sharing little bits of information that we can then use as we go out into the world. So I don't think that preaching to the choir is a bad thing, because we're talking about strategies in going out there. I agree. So I teach a required diversity class, and there are a lot of people. First semester, clearly I wasn't doing a very good job. But first semester, the end evaluations were, I'm not a racist, I don't know why I need to take this class. And I'm like, well, clearly I haven't done my job because we're all a little bit racist, right? So clearly that didn't get across. So where was I going with that, right? This idea of preaching outside the choir, I think is important, but because we can't get them into the space, we then have to take these messages that we've acquired out to them. And to go back to, going to the fighting, other people fighting for other freedoms that are not at the forefront of our mind are also essential to getting the information that's happening there so we can take them back to, environmentalists and catch if somebody says something that's a little microaggressive to a group that's not present, that you have the tools to say, hey, this is why that's not cool. And when it comes from somebody who's already in your in-group, it's not as threatening. So that's my opinion on preaching to the choir. And I hope that everybody here has walked away with something you didn't know, or some way of phrasing an argument that you hadn't thought of before. And you've got one more tool in your toolkit for engaging with others when you go out into the world. And even though I'm preaching to the choir, I'm still trying to share new and innovative skills.
I think you have a really good question, and it's really important. And I have one of the things that I think is really important, and I agree with you about the freedom fighters, that we need people who are going to go out there and fight for justice. It's really important to do that. But I also think it's important to know who your elected officials are. I think it's important to be involved in the government. I think it's important to be able to know who these people are. For example, I have spoken so much to my congressman about the issue of preemptive prosecution of Muslims that every time he sees me, he thinks Muslim, which is the appropriate response. And so I think it's important I think it's important to call out people when you can. When public officials go out in public to make public statements, if you know about it, it's a really good time to talk to them about your issue. And I always, when I see public officials go out in public and I have an issue that's really important for me to talk to them about, I talk to them about it. And I don't care if they try to run away or they try to dismiss me, but I think it's really important. And it's also important to understand how the local government works, how the laws work, and when you have an understanding of the mechanisms of how the government is, then you can influence it. And I think that is another way, it's just another tool in your toolkit to be able to go out and get your message across, which is so important. And run for office. We need more young people of color to run for office. We need more women to run for office. Women make a lot of difference. We need that, and people need to do that.
Thank you very much, both of you, for sharing so much with us this evening. Let's give a round of applause. And just before everyone leaves, we just want to remind folks about the
Interfaith Dinner Dialogue. Again, it's going to be this Wednesday in the Noble Room at Hendricks Chapel. We're going to be discussing Islamophobia on campus, and again, I'm sure we'll come up with a lot of discussion on a lot of microaggressions there. So please be there, bring your friends, let people know. It's a good discussion, and it's always an open and lively event for everyone to share whatever thoughts you have.
dinner and ASL notification will be included.
Oh, and just one more thing. If anyone wants to talk to me about, and Catherine Hughes, about Dr. Raphael DeFeer's case, we'll stay for a few minutes afterwards.
Thank you very much for coming tonight.